You'll find it in Addison County, a half-hour's ride from Middlebury if the wheels don't lock up in the slush, a Vermont town with less population than secrets, tucked beneath the shadow of Mount Abraham. It's called Red Hall now, but in 1888 it was still Birch Hollow, named for the way the trees wrapped their roots around everything as if to keep it buried. The winters then weren't just cold, they were quiet, stillness like packed wool. And in that stillness, voices carry, even the ones that aren't alive anymore. My name is Daniel Harrow. I've been telling stories for nearly 20 years, the kind you can't unhear. But this one took me deeper than I've ever gone, into cellar doors that hadn't opened in a century, into brittle newspaper columns from a town that tried to erase itself, and into a sound, a voice, recorded on wax cylinder that has haunted me since I first heard it. A voice that doesn't belong to any living child. A voice that, by all accounts, should have never existed at all. This is the story of the Ainsley family, of how their name once meant safety, prosperity, and salvation, and how their basement became a site of such unnatural torment the locals still salt the soil every fall. I arrived in Red Hall, or what used to be Birch Hollow, on a snowy morning in March, the 21st to be exact. There was still frost sheeting the ground, and my boots left a crunch that echoed too long. As I stepped into the old town square, I found what I always find in places like this: a church, a post office, and people who wish you'd never come looking. The Ainsley house still stands, though now it's boarded up, privately owned, and listed as condemned after an arson attempt in the 1970s. The townspeople refer to it only as that house, never by name. And if you ask about it too loud, the conversation ends. If you press further, you're met with silence. But I've always believed the land remembers what people try to forget, and Birch Hollow remembers the Ainsleys. The first mention of them in public record is 1857, a marriage license between Thomas Ainsley, a textile merchant from Providence, and Elizabeth Carr, a school teacher from Bar. They moved to Birch Hollow the following spring, purchased a large colonial home on Dunlow Hill, and quickly became patrons of the church, the schoolhouse, and eventually the town itself. Thomas was generous, known for opening his home during winters to struggling families. Elizabeth taught Sunday school and ran a children's reading room in their parlor every Thursday. By all accounts, they were charitable, beloved, and deeply devout. They never had children of their own, not publicly at least. That's the part that always catches the breath in your throat. Because between 1861 and 1887, the town's birth records show over a dozen children in residence at the Ainsley household. None of them bore the Ainsley name. All were listed as wards, or simply noted as charitable custody, and none of them stayed past the age of 10. I first came across this case while researching orphan migration routes in the post-bellum Northeast. A retired archivist in Albany sent me a list of deviant census anomalies. Her words, not mine. Birch Hollow stood out. Multiple children, wrong surnames, undocumented transfers, and finally, a wax cylinder catalogued only as Vocal Ainsley Basement 1888, Child Distress. I assumed it was mislabeled, maybe a dramatic reenactment or a hoax. But I was wrong. That recording, which I'll play for you later in this series, is the most chilling thing I've ever heard. Not because of the scream, but because of the lullaby. A lullaby that doesn't match any known folk song or language and ends with a phrase whispered in a voice so cracked with age, you'd think it came from something trying to sound like a child. In 1890, the house was emptied. No ceremony, no sale, just gone. A sheriff's deputy filed a brief note about found remains in the lower stairwell and sealed the record with a string of code letters I had to decode via civil documentation law from the 19th century. The letters spelled GBCF, grave by circumstantial forensics. They didn't find a body, just blood, and a tiny velvet ribbon, pressed into the underside of a floorboard. The rest of the basement was bricked in, and no child was ever officially declared dead on the Ainsley property. This is how it begins, not with a scream, but with a hymn that shouldn't exist, and the voice of a little girl, still trapped in a cold stone cellar beneath a house no one should have trusted. My name is Daniel Harrow, and this is the Macabre Record. Stay with me. Thomas Wycliffe Ainsley was born in 1824 in Providence, Rhode Island, the son of a devout textile miller and a mother who died giving birth to his younger sister. By 20, Thomas had studied under the Congregationalist ministry and trained in industrial dye manufacturing, an uncommon blend of theology and chemistry. He married Elizabeth Carr in the winter of 1856. Her family, noted for their stoic faith and educational modesty, had deep ties to early religious reform schools across New England. A year after their wedding, Thomas and Elizabeth arrived in Birch Hollow with wagons full of books, furniture, and handcrafted children's furniture. The property they bought was a 12-room clapboard colonial on Dunlow Hill, painted white with green shutters, gables tall enough to pierce the mist. Locals nicknamed it the Gabled Lantern, because of the way it glowed with gaslight on winter nights. They opened their doors within the first week. An old town record from 1858, digitized by a retired local historian, shows a town meeting where Thomas Ainsley pledged monthly donations to the Birch Hollow Mission Fund, the schoolhouse, and the infirmary. Elizabeth, meanwhile, began hosting scripture evenings for children, offering them warm milk and ginger biscuits in the parlor. She read aloud from Pilgrim's Progress and gave each child a prayer token before they left. She wrote in elegant penmanship. Her church donation envelopes were always sealed with wax in the shape of a child's handprint. By 1860, she'd earned a new name in town, the Mother Without Birth. Everyone admired her. Pity, reverence, and awe swirled around her like perfume. People said she glowed when children sat at her feet. No one thought it strange when, later that year, the Ainsleys took in their first ward, a 6-year-old boy from nearby Fairhaven. He was never publicly named. By 1864, 5 children had passed through the Ainsley household. All of them were said to have been orphans or children of fallen women, as Elizabeth's Sunday Journal noted. She believed her home was a place of sanctification, a sort of purifying rest before judgment or reform. Some of the children returned to relatives. Others were reportedly sent to distant cousins or adopted through church arrangements, but none of them ever appeared in school records, and none, were ever seen by classmates. Local accounts describe the children only in passing: a blurred figure at a second-story window, a laugh heard in the fog. One shopkeeper, Elwood Remy, recalled selling peppermint lozenges to a quiet girl in a bonnet, maybe 10 years old, but when he asked her name, she smiled like she'd forgotten how to speak. The Ainsleys insisted they homeschooled the children. They believed in what Thomas called the isolation of innocence. It was written in a sermon he gave in 1867, in which he argued, "Let no worldly eye cloud the tender purity of a child's breath. For once they taste the shadow of the crowd, they begin to rot from within." There is one photograph of the Ainsley family, if we can call it that, a daguerreotype from 1872, taken by an itinerant photographer named Mortimer Bales. The photo was stored in a cigar box in the back of a Birch Hollow antique shop. The owner let me scan it. It shows Thomas and Elizabeth standing in front of their home, stiff and formal, beside what appears to be 3 children, 2 boys, 1 girl, all wearing high-collared tunics. But here's the thing, the children's faces are blurred, not by age or damage. Daguerreotypes don't blur. They require stillness. They capture detail. And yet, the children's eyes look clouded, as if something moved inside them while their bodies stood still. One of the boys wears a key around his neck. The girl clutches something dark in her hand, and all 3 are barefoot, despite the snow visible on the porch rail. When I showed the image to forensic daguerreotype analyst Dr. Lenore Mattis at Boston University, she hesitated. Then she said, "They were alive when the photo was taken, but I don't think they were free." That's when I knew this wasn't a story about benevolent caretakers. This was about ritual, about confinement disguised as compassion. The Ainsleys weren't saviors. They were stewards of something far older than charity. In 1875, Thomas published a small booklet titled "Through Fire to Heaven, Lessons in the Sanctity of Suffering." It was printed privately, only 200 copies. I've tracked down two. The passages are cryptic but obsessed with refinement, obedience, and the testing of the flesh. One line in particular stayed with me. The cry of the unspoiled child is not to be soothed, it is to be guided downward until silence redeems them. A D in the margins of one copy, a faded note in Elizabeth's hand. Silence was always the last lesson. They say Birch Hollow was a quiet town. But I wonder now if that silence wasn't natural. I wonder if it was learned. The children of the Ainsley house were seen, then vanished. They left no names, no gravestones, just the echo of a lullaby no one else seems to remember, and one voice on one recording that should never have lasted this long. If you speak with the descendants of Birch Hollow's early settlers today, and if they trust you enough to share anything at all, you'll hear the same phrase over and over. There was always something off. Not evil, not violent, just misaligned, like a painting hung just a half-inch askew, or a melody with one sour note repeated too calmly. It began, they say, with the smell. A sour, burning odor that leaked from the Ainsley chimney every third Sunday of the month. Astringent chemical, not quite wood smoke. People said it stung the eyes. Livestock avoided the fence line near the Ainsley property those days. Dogs howled in the middle of the night. Horses refused to face the hill. But no one complained. Not openly. Why would they? Thomas Ainsley was one of the church's top donors, and Elizabeth had the kindest eyes of any woman you'd ever meet, as one aging parishioner recalled. Still, people began to wonder. I came across an 1873 letter from a woman named Caroline Murta to her sister in New Hampshire. The letter, now archived at the Vermont Historical Society, reads, "Little Josie was invited to the Ainsley home last week for lessons with Miss Elizabeth. When she returned, she wouldn't speak for nearly 2 days, just stared at her hands, mumbling something about the quiet place beneath the quiet. Caroline never sent Josie back. And Josie never explained. I found no mention of this event in the Ainsley journals, but that phrase, the quiet place beneath the quiet, will return later, more than once. Then there were the lights. Several former residents whose grandparents lived through the Ainsley era recall hearing stories of strange illuminations under the house. An oral account recorded in the 1950s by amateur folklorist Imogen Pell describes a dull blue flickering from the vents under the porch, like someone had candles burning beneath the floor. Keep in mind, there was no finished basement at that time. Blueprints from 1858 show a simple root cellar, no electricity, no known sub-chambers, and yet the lights came back, blue, faint, repeating every month like clockwork. Some children in town began calling it the ghost glow. Others simply avoided the path up Dunlow Hill entirely. I spoke with one of the last living descendants of a Birch Hollow schoolteacher, a woman named Ada Penrose. Her grandmother, Miss Lillian Penrose, taught arithmetic in the 1870s, and in her final lesson journal from 1878, Miss Penrose made a note about a peculiar child, boy of about 7, no shoes, came to school unannounced, said his name was 9. When asked for a surname, he smiled and said, "She said I don't need one anymore." He had several welts on the back of his hands, claimed he earned them, never seen again. No records exist of this boy, no guardianship notice, no church mention, and yet, in Elizabeth Ainsley's prayer journal that same week, a simple entry reads, "9 has wandered, must rebuild the lesson, 9. It wasn't a name, it was a number." That's when I started reviewing Elizabeth's old journals more carefully. Every few months, she'd note a new student by number. 2 is nearly complete. 5 cries too often. 10 shows great promise but must be quieted. No names, no birthplaces, just numbers. And this chilled me the most. 1 entry, dated June 4th, 1884. 3 was too fragile. I feared this. The ash will be returned to the soil. I searched the cemetery for any child interred that summer. Nothing, but a carpenter's journal in the Addison County Archive noted, "Repaired Ainsley floor beam, warped from damp, strange stain beneath, refused pay, told Mr. Ainsley not to summon me again. He never returned. No other tradesman worked on the Ainsley home for the next 3 years. Then came the sounds. One neighbor, an old widower named Josiah Lorne, recorded a bizarre complaint in his ledger, now housed in the Middlebury College Library. Can't sleep on account of that awful humming, always at night, always from their cellar. Thought it was bees at first, but it moves like voices, long, low voices, like a child holding a note too long. Several accounts echo this strange singing, whispers or lullabies at odd hours. Some claim to hear it from half a mile away, and always the same phrase at the end, "Don't wake the ones beneath." None of this made it into official records, because no one wanted to accuse the Ainsleys. They were generous, holy, good, and the children, well, maybe they just left. Maybe they were sent on to better homes. Maybe it wasn't your place to ask questions, but questions still formed. In the way the Ainsleys refused visits past sundown, in how Elizabeth once lashed out at a midwife for asking about that limp little girl in the garden, in how Thomas quietly reinforced the cellar door with 3 separate locks. By 1885, the townsfolk no longer brought their children to the Ainsleys' reading room. Some said it was illness, others just nodded and said, "Too much God in that house, not enough love." But the Ainsleys didn't stop. If anything, they became more intense, more private, and the children, whatever remained of them, faded even further from view. And under the frozen soil of Dunlow Hill, something was waiting, listening, preparing for the lesson that would never end. By the end of 1885, the Ainsley house was quiet in the way that makes your ears ring, the kind of quiet you only find in places where something terrible is being hidden, not behind locked doors, but behind politeness, behind sermons, behind the illusion of grace. The signs were there. They had always been there, but now those signs weren't just whispers in the wind or chalk marks on a porch. They were in the town's posture, shoulders hunched, heads turned away. They were in the children who refused to walk past Dunlow Hill, and they were in the letters never answered, the visits never returned, and the hollow looks passed over pews in silence. The Ainsleys were not just isolating themselves, they were being left alone, intentionally. In 1886, the church records show that the Ainsleys stopped attending Sunday service in person. Instead, Thomas began submitting typed sermons to be read aloud by proxy, typed, not handwritten. This was unusual. Typewriters were still rare, expensive, and considered impersonal in rural Vermont. But Thomas insisted, said his hand had grown unsteady. Privately, the pastor's wife told a friend that she suspected something was wrong with him. He had lost weight. His skin looked chalk white, like winter bread. And once, when she passed him in town, he didn't seem to recognize her at all. Around that same time, a local seamstress named Martha Kelt reported something odd to the town ledger. Delivered 6 child's nightgowns to the Ainsley residents, all different sizes. None of the children came to the door. Only Miss Elizabeth. She smiled, too long, asked if I could stitch a V inside each collar. When I asked what for, she said, "For victory over self." Felt wrong. I didn't go back. Victory over self. I found that phrase again and again in the Ainsleys' private writings. In Elizabeth's prayer journal, it's repeated 24 times across 4 months. Once, she even drew a small hand beneath it, just 5 fingers and a stitched V in the palm. Something changed in the house. The windows stayed shut, even on hot days. The garden was left to rot, weeds curling around rusting tools like vines around forgotten bones. And Thomas, once a familiar figure in the square, vanished entirely from public view. The only person anyone still saw was Elizabeth, but even she changed. Mrs. Penny Dowes, who worked at the Birch Hollow apothecary, wrote in a private note, "Elizabeth Ainsley came in for tincture of valerian. Her hands were shaking, asked if laudanum could be made into a child's tonic. I said no. She smiled and said, 'I'll find another way to quiet them.' I thought she meant the voices, but now I think she meant the children." The town physician, Dr. Aldous Cleary, logged 2 separate house visits to the Ainsleys that year. both under anonymous requests, both involving minor fractures sustained from stair-related incidents, both patients unnamed, no follow-up, no official file. The doctor retired the following year. His journal ends abruptly in the middle of a sentence about the Ainsleys. All it says is, it's not what's broken on the outside that matters, it's what they're breaking on the inside. Around this time, a strange pattern began to emerge. Residents reported seeing unfamiliar children briefly, a figure in a window, a pale face at dusk near the woods, but these children never spoke, never played, and never appeared more than once. One particularly disturbing account comes from a dairy farmer named Elias Grum. He claimed he saw a small boy standing still as stone in the field near the Ainsley house. When Elias called out, the boy turned, but his mouth never moved, and then he simply walked backward, slowly, into the trees. Elias refused to speak about it again, but in his journal, one line stood out. His eyes weren't scared, they were already empty. Inside the Ainsley home, the ritual of control became everything. According to the recovered journals, Elizabeth implemented what she called the 12 quiet hours. From dusk to dawn, absolute silence was enforced. No speech, no crying, no movement above the main floor. She wrote, "Any sound in darkness draws the listening ones. We are the guardians of silence now." Who were the listening ones? She never explains. But a former church member, in a confidential interview conducted in 1972, recalled Elizabeth saying something unsettling at a scripture circle years prior. "Some children are born with too much voice. We are called to pare them down, to hollow the noise out of them. Only then can they sing the proper way." And then, on October 12, 1886, the Ainsleys adopted a girl. Her name was Mary Delane, age 7, from an orphanage in Montpellier. This is the only child whose records we have in full. A frail, sickly child with brittle bones and chronic bronchial weakness. A note from the orphanage warned she was prone to sleepwalking and often talked in her sleep about things that frightened the other children. She was transferred without ceremony. Elizabeth simply signed the papers and left. Mary was never seen again. But in Elizabeth's journal, a week after the girl's arrival, she wrote, "The sleep tongue must be broken. The hymn has been corrupted. She will be the one to refine the key." The entries after that grow more frantic, less scripture, more symbols. Inverted crosses drawn beside children's names, words like purge, unbraid and deepen the voice. And finally, on the last page of the 1886 journal, "One will resist, one always does. That is the one we must keep." By 1887, the Ainsleys had completely withdrawn from town. No more sermons, no more charity, no more invitations to the reading room. And yet, strange noises still rose from the hill. Whispers, flickering blue light, and the faint rhythmic sound of something tapping beneath the floorboards, over and over, like someone knocking, not to get in, but to get out. In the autumn of 1887, Birch Hollow's frost came early, the crops failed, the livestock thinned, and on Dunlow Hill, behind the shuttered windows of the Ainsley house, something finally broke. We often talk about a triggering incident in these cases, one moment that shatters the illusion, brings the hidden into view. But in Birch Hollow, it wasn't just one event. It was three strange, overlapping incidents, none of them clearly linked, all of them pointing back inevitably to the basement. The first was a fire, not in the house itself, but in the woods behind it. According to a surviving log from the Birch Hollow Fire Society, on October 2, 1887, smoke was spotted rising near Dunlow Hill. A volunteer crew approached and found a series of scorched stumps and what one man described as a burn pile. But there were no logs, no paper, only fabric, small blackened strips of linen and wool, some patterned with stars, others plain, and one, half melted, revealed a tiny embroidered V near the collar seam. The fire was extinguished quickly, but the crew found something else buried in the ash, a small wooden block, carved crudely with the number 11 burned into one side. The item was handed to Sheriff Merton Bligh, who noted it in the county incident log. The next day, the log was removed from the archive. Sheriff Bly resigned the following month. The second incident involved a man named Jonah Bell, a gravedigger by trade, quiet, reliable. On October 6th, 4 days after the fire, Jonah was discovered wandering barefoot near the cemetery at dawn, muttering nonsense. The town record states he was taken to the infirmary, where he kept repeating the phrase, "She's in the wall, she's in the wall, not dead, but wrong." He scratched at his own arms until they bled. When a nurse asked who she was, he cried out, "The girl who sings wrong." They made her go quiet. They said they had to twist her back. Jonah was committed to the Montpellier asylum and never returned. But among his belongings was found a torn, damp scrap of velvet ribbon, and this note, hastily scribbled, "Voice won't stop, even with dirt in her mouth." Then came the third incident, and it's this one that cracked everything open. The one even the townspeople couldn't ignore. It came from inside the Ainsley home. On the evening of October 11th, 1887, two passers-by, an older couple returning from church, reported hearing screaming from the Ainsley residence. Not an argument, not illness, but high, shrill screaming, as if someone was being burned alive. They rushed to the church and summoned Pastor Ellison. By the time he arrived at the house, the screaming had stopped. Thomas Ainsley answered the door, alone, composed, wearing gloves. When asked if everything was all right, Thomas calmly replied, "We are conducting a lesson. She needed reminding." Pastor Ellison insisted on speaking with Elizabeth. Thomas refused, so the pastor went to the sheriff. But by the time Sheriff Bly returned to the house that night, no one answered. The windows were dark, and the front porch was soaked, not with rain, but with something thicker. The sheriff said it looked like lamp oil, but smelled like salt and old copper. The next morning, a parcel arrived at the church, wrapped in brown paper, tied with twine. Inside, a folded dress, child-sized, burnt around the hem, still warm. Pinned to the collar, a note written in Elizabeth's hand. "She will not return, but she will never leave." No signature, no explanation, just a small, dark smear near the bottom. Later tested, years later, as human blood. That's when someone finally spoke up. Martha Kelt, the seamstress I mentioned earlier, the one who sewed the nightgowns, walked into the town hall with a bundle of papers, receipts, correspondence, and one letter addressed to her from Elizabeth, dated 3 weeks prior. "Please prepare 7 garments, ages ranging from 5 to 12, include 2 binding wraps and a hush cap. The lesson has expanded. We are close to the 12th. A hush cap. That's not a term you find in sewing catalogues. But in early 19th century reform schools, it was a restraint, a cloth device meant to cover a child's mouth. Martha's evidence finally reached the county magistrate in Middlebury. An inquiry was opened, but slowly, quietly. There was no forced entry, no raid, just a welfare check. One man, a young physician named Dr. Harold Keene, and what he found changed him forever. In a preserved letter to his brother, never published until now, Dr. Keene wrote, "The house was wrong. The air was thick but cold. I was let in by Mrs. Ainsley herself, who smiled with her mouth but not her eyes. I asked to see the children. She said, 'They are in instruction.' I asked to speak with one. She said, 'They do not speak until the work is done.' I heard something then, a low humming, not human, not constant, but layered, like multiple mouths out of sync. He didn't stay long. He wasn't allowed into the basement, but before he left, he saw something. In the hallway, just past the stairwell, was a door, wooden, thick, carved into it, a large Roman numeral, dotin, 12, and scratched beneath it, just visible through the varnish, a tiny handprint, pressed in blood. Dr. Keene filed a formal complaint with the county 2 days later, but the case was tabled, too vague, no direct evidence of abuse, and the Ainsleys were respected. The door was closed, but the house was not silent. Not yet, because the child's voice hadn't stopped. It had just gone under. In cases like this, there's always a moment when the system almost worked, when someone knocked on the right door, filled out the right form, raised the right red flag, and then, was told to wait, told to be patient, told they didn't see what they saw. For the Ainsley case, that moment came in late October of 1887, and the one who saw the truth, who tried to act, was Dr. Harold Keene. Let me tell you about him. He was 28 years old at the time, fresh from Boston, recently credentialed in pediatric medicine. He had no ties to Birch Hollow. He came only at the request of his cousin, Sheriff Bly, who said something strange was happening on Dunlow Hill. Dr. Keene had a habit of writing everything down. He kept clinical notes, personal letters, and even copied his own interviews, typed on crisp onion skin paper and filed into a private dossier, recovered decades later by a distant nephew. That dossier now sits in my studio. Here's what Dr. Keene wrote after his visit to the Ainsleys. Mrs. Ainsley presented as composed, lucid, and articulate. Her home was clean, immaculate even, but the scent in the hallway was troubling, like old rust and time. I requested to observe the children under their guardianship. She led me to the parlor, where 3 children sat on the floor, backs straight, eyes forward. None of them acknowledged me. He noted their unusual pallor, the rigidity in their posture, the way they seemed suspended like mannequins dressed to mimic life. I attempted to engage with the smallest, girl, perhaps 6 or 7. She did not blink when addressed. She only turned her head slowly and whispered something I could not hear. Dr. Keene leaned in. She repeated it. 12 weights under. One must not speak. He left the house disturbed. More than that, haunted. He wrote to the county magistrate that same evening, urging immediate investigation. He even listed potential charges: failure to educate, possible ritual abuse, psychological deprivation, malnourishment. But this was 1887. No social workers, no hotline, and in rural Vermont, the word ritual still meant religious, not dangerous. The magistrate delayed. 3 days later, Dr. Keene returned, this time with a deputy from Middlebury. They brought with them a court-issued welfare writ. What happened that day is recorded only in fragments. Because the deputy, Matthew Harlan, refused to speak publicly after that visit, he left the force 3 weeks later, moved to Ohio, died in a sanitarium at age 46. But in his final statement, sealed in a private journal found by his son, he wrote, "We knocked. A child answered the door." Let that sit for a moment. A child, not Elizabeth, not Thomas. A child with hair matted to her temples, dressed in a too large robe. She said only this: "They're not done yet. You shouldn't see the quiet part." Then she closed the door. Dr. Keene, growing increasingly desperate, reached out to a Boston colleague, Dr. Elias Worley, a professor of child psychiatry and early ritual trauma studies. Worley agreed to assist. He reviewed the dossier, the journal notes, the descriptions. His conclusion: this is not neglect. This is a belief system. But before Worley could act, the Ainsleys made their next move. On November 4, 1887, Elizabeth submitted a formal letter to the county court declaring that the children in her care were now of spiritual majority. It's a phrase with no legal standing, but the document included notarized affidavits from church elders, not from Birch Hollow, but from fringe sects in Barr and Colchester, all of them attesting that the children were vowed to the silence path. When Dr. Keene tried to refute the filing, he received an unsigned warning note at his boarding house. "Do not unmake what has already been cleansed. The voice is meant to stay buried." 2 nights later, his room was broken into. His dossier was rifled, his typewriter ribbon torn in half, and on his pillow, a small wooden block. He left Birch Hollow soon after, returned to Boston, never spoke publicly about the case again. In his private diary, the final Ainsley entry reads, "I heard her again. The little girl from the parlor. She was humming, through the walls, through the plaster, even here, hundreds of miles away." He died in 1903, heart failure. But the attending nurse reported that, in his final moments, he whispered, "It's still singing, under the house." Meanwhile, back in Birch Hollow, the town seemed content to let the matter fade. The church stopped asking questions. Neighbors stopped glancing uphill, and the Ainsley house, tall and white and watching, sat undisturbed. On Christmas Day, 1887, Elizabeth Ainsley sent a note to the pastor. "We have completed the cycle. 12 will not be divided. No more voices." Inside the envelope, 12 strands of hair, braided together and bound with a red velvet ribbon. No one came to investigate. No one opened the basement door, and the voices, at least to the townspeople, finally went quiet. But I don't think they ever stopped. I think they simply went deeper, waiting. Some stories die when the headlines fade. Others rot in silence, their bones hidden behind bureaucracy and neglect. But sometimes, just sometimes, someone comes along who refuses to let the silence win. Her name was Lillian Cartwright, and she wasn't supposed to find the Ainsley case. She was researching inheritance fraud in rural Vermont when she stumbled upon the burial records from Birch Hollow, 12 blank notations for 12 unnamed miners, all tied to the same property, all buried, or listed as such, between 1878 and 1887. The location, the Ainsley estate, Dunlow Hill. No birth records, no medical history, just one repeating initial on the ledgers, E.A. witness and custodian. Lillian was 29, a former stenographer for the borough court system turned investigative reporter for the Boston Weekly Examiner. Her methods were blunt. She didn't wait for permission. She asked the questions no one wanted asked. In the spring of 1891, 4 years after the last confirmed sighting of a child at the Ainsley home, she arrived in Birch Hollow with 2 notebooks, a hand-crank phonograph, and a pistol hidden beneath her skirts. She began by speaking to the old, the bitter, and the nearly forgotten. People like Dorothy Pennick, who used to sweep the Ainsley's porch on Fridays in exchange for biscuits and ribbons. Now, near blind and nearly 70, Dorothy recalled a sound that chilled her, even 40 years later. It was like a child trying to talk with her mouth sewn shut. The sound made my teeth hurt. Then there was Gilbert Wainscott, whose older brother once helped install shelving in the Ainsley root cellar. Lillian found him in a convalescent home outside Montpellier. His story had never been written down, because it had never been believed. They told me not to go downstairs, but I did. It wasn't a cellar anymore. There were walls that didn't line up right, like 2 basements pressed together sideways, and in one of them there was a bed, made of iron, with leather cuffs at the corners. Lillian documented everything. She returned to the public records, compared census data from 1870, 1880, and 1890. She mapped a disturbing pattern. Between those years, 15 children were recorded as having lived on the Ainsley property in official town census logs. But by the following year of each census, none remained. No deaths, no adoptions, no transfers to orphanages or guardians, just gone. Each time, the final note beside their names, transferred to religious care, and each time, signed by Elizabeth Ainsley. But it was what Lillian found next that broke the case wide open. Hidden in the archives of the Addison County Courthouse, behind a misfiled inheritance dispute, was a sealed envelope addressed to "Whom it may concern, in the event of my death." It was written by Dr. Harold Keene. Inside, pages of handwritten testimony, descriptions of the children, sketches of strange diagrams carved into the Ainsley hallway floor, and one name repeated: Mary Delane, the last documented child to enter the Ainsley home. No exit ever recorded. Lillian filed a petition with the state, using the Keene testimony, burial anomalies, and census inconsistencies to demand a formal exhumation of the Ainsley grounds. She was denied twice. The third time, she brought a stenographer, a lawyer, and 3 newspaper editors from Montpellier. This time they didn't ask. They showed up. On October 7, 1891, they were granted temporary access to the property under an antiquated Religious Reform Act, meant originally to protect children in state custody. What they found stunned even the most hardened among them. Lillian's written report, published in the Examiner under the title "The House That Swallowed Children," described the following. The house interior is in a state of preserved decay. Dust covers everything, yet the dining table remains set. 11 chairs, one noticeably smaller. Upstairs, each room is numbered with a Roman numeral. Inside, crude makeshift beds, symbols on the walls, long mirrors facing inward. No photographs, no toys. But it was the basement, once sealed behind bricked plaster, that finally confirmed the worst. They removed the bricks and found another door. It had no handle, only 12 slats across it, each carved with a single letter, SILENCED, and below, painted in faded red, 12 voices, one hymn. No exit. Behind the door was not a root cellar. It was a chamber, circular, stone-lined, with iron rings bolted to the walls. In the center, a shallow depression filled with bones, small, human, each buried in linen wraps, each tagged with a Roman numeral. And in the far corner, withered and fused to the wall, a velvet ribbon, still stained with something too dark to name. The press exploded. Birch Hollow residents denied knowledge. The church dissolved its records, and what remained of the Ainsley family name crumbled to ash. But Lillian wasn't done. She tracked down church correspondences, land grants, and orphanage withdrawals across the entire state. She found a dozen more cases, children transferred to private care, never heard from again. Some were never even missed. No family, no inquiry, just silence. And then, one final discovery. In a crate beneath the floorboards of the old Birch Hollow Records office, a wax phonograph cylinder, labeled only Ainsley, 1888, voice. Lillian had no way to play it then, but she preserved it. And in 2019, that cylinder was recovered and restored. What it captured will be shared in an upcoming episode, but I will tell you this. It was a child, a girl, singing something no one recognized until the final line. I tried to be quiet, but it still heard me. History has a way of hiding its most grotesque truths beneath polite paperwork. It's never a scream. It's a missing form, a vanished signature, a dead file folder buried beneath a mislabeled drawer. But Lillian Cartwright didn't just uncover the bones in the basement. She peeled back the walls around them. And what she found was not just negligence, nor madness. It was a pattern. A deliberate, systematized program of spiritual control, deception, and abuse that crossed county lines and outlived every child it touched. It began with a single name, Mary Delane. We've mentioned her before. She was the last child officially brought into the Ainsley household, the sickly 7-year-old girl from Montpellier, prone to sleepwalking, whose cries terrified other orphans. When Lillian tracked down her intake records from the St. Bridget Orphan Asylum, she noticed two peculiar details. Mary was not officially listed as adopted. Her file said, ward transferred via private spiritual sponsorship. Her departure was not signed by a member of the clergy, but by a third-party notary whose signature matched several other withdrawals from different Vermont orphanages. The name, Elbridge T. Langham, a church registrar who, upon further investigation, turned out to be more than a simple bureaucrat. Langham was a lay preacher tied to a fringe sect called the Congregation of Stillness, an offshoot of Calvinist penitential doctrine. The group believed that children were born impure, carrying the noise of ancestral sin. They preached that only through ritual silence, restraint, and the surrendering of voice could a child be tuned to spiritual frequency. Sound familiar? Langham visited multiple orphanages in Vermont, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts between 1875 and 1886. Lillian's research showed that wherever he traveled, children were taken into private spiritual custody, and none were seen again. That's when the false documents started surfacing. Lillian cross-referenced census records, church registries, and orphan withdrawals with tax filings, property transfers, and court documents. She discovered forged death certificates, some naming diseases that hadn't existed in the state for years. She found baptismal records without corresponding births, guardianship claims that were never signed by a judge, even donations to non-existent chapels. But the most chilling discovery was a ledger, kept by Thomas Ainsley himself, found hidden beneath a false panel in his writing desk. The entries were sparse, clinical. Number 6, failed vocal obedience, re-entered. No, 9, regressed, placed under. No, 12 requires deeper instruction, attempted incount. There were no names, only numbers. And at the bottom of the final page, a phrase scrawled so furiously the ink had bled through the wood. One remains unfinished. She still sings in the dirt. Simultaneously, medical files began to surface. One nurse, now elderly and half-blind, wrote to Lillian anonymously. She had once worked at a sanitarium that briefly housed a mute girl in the early spring of 1888. The girl had no name, no next of kin. She was found wandering the edge of a frozen lake near Birch Hollow, barefoot, clutching a velvet ribbon. She had deep ligatures scarring around her wrists and faint branding on her shoulder. The nurse said the mark resembled a Roman numeral, 2 seen. The girl never spoke, but she hummed, constantly, the same 4-note progression, over and over, until one day she vanished from the ward. The official report says she was transferred to a religious recovery home. No such home existed. The deeper Lillian dug, the more widespread the rot became. The Congregation of Stillness wasn't just operating out of the Ainsley home. They had chapters, secret insular fellowships embedded within church networks, all using the same coded language, shepherding the silence, cleansing through still voice, binding the cry. They believed in transformation through deprivation, that removing a child's voice was akin to removing their earthly stain, that only then could they receive the sacred tone. Lillian found prayer manuals, black-covered volumes printed without publisher marks, titled things like The Voice Below Flesh, Unquiring the Innocent. Each copy she recovered had a recurring emblem, a child's face with no mouth. And then there were the symbols, found carved into floorboards, etched into bedposts, branded onto the walls of the Ainsley basement. Dr. Elias Worley, the Boston psychiatrist who reviewed them for Lillian, noted that the symbols mirrored a combination of alchemical silent sigils and 16th-century monastic ciphers. It's as if they were attempting to refine the human mind through removal of input, like spiritual vivisection. And yet, the children didn't die from ritual. They died from abandonment, starvation, isolation, or worse. The state, under mounting pressure from the press, finally convened a formal inquiry in 1892. It concluded, there is insufficient evidence to conclude that criminal activity occurred at the Ainsley residence beyond historical neglect and spiritual excess. No arrests, no indictments. The basement was resealed, and the house was declared historically sensitive and left to decay. But Lillian didn't stop. She took the story national. And the headline that ran in the New York Courier on July 6, 1892, read, Buried Voices, Vermont's Cult of Silent Children. She lost her job 6 months later, received death threats, fled Boston entirely. Her last letter, never sent, was addressed to a colleague at the Examiner. I can't sleep. The humming is in the walls of this house too. I think it followed me. She was found dead in her rented room in New Haven, apparent laudanum overdose, but pinned to her chest, a velvet ribbon and a note. One remains unfinished. To most people, horror is event-driven, a murder, a disappearance, a scream. But in the case of the Ainsley children, horror came from a belief, not just what was done, but why it was done. And that why is where the real sickness lives. In this part of the story, I have to warn you, we're descending into the mind of those who believed silence was holy, obedience was purification, and children, especially children, were born broken. This isn't superstition. It isn't a misunderstanding of mental illness. It's theology turned cancerous, and it begins with a doctrine you've never heard of, because most of it was burned. The Congregation of Stillness began as a fringe interpretation of New England Protestantism. It formed around the idea that God did not speak through fire or wind or even scripture, but through the absence of all sound. That silence was not just reverence, but a form of cosmic tuning. To be pure was to be quiet. At its heart was a single, deeply disturbing premise. Children are born as vessels of unrefined chaos, screaming, bleeding, impulsive noise. And unless their voice is purified, they remain spiritually unformed. That word, purified, comes up again and again in the texts we've recovered. In the voice below, Flesh, a foundational track discovered in the personal belongings of Thomas Ainsley, the author writes, "The Lord does not enter a room of clamour. He waits in the quiet mouth. In the unspeaking child, he finds his chamber." The text advocates for the binding of children during spiritual instruction, deprivation of speech, exposure to prolonged isolation, and the eradication of inherited sin through silence conditioning. And it goes further. It claims that when 12 children are successfully silenced, when their voices are quieted to death or to holy stillness, a harmonic gate is opened, a thin place where divine frequencies touch the flawed chord of earth. Ooh, it's mysticism, it's madness, but it was followed devoutly. Now consider the timeline. The Ainsleys took in 12 children, one at a time, over a period of 11 years. Each was referred to not by name, but by number. Their spiritual progression was documented using phrases taken directly from the congregation's doctrine. And the final child, number 12, is mentioned repeatedly in Elizabeth's later writings as the one who sings wrong. From her final recovered journal, 12 must be refined through more than removal. She repeats the flesh melody, her mouth is not yet ash. Now think back to the house, the 12 rooms, the door in the basement with 12 slats. Each child wasn't just silenced. They were placed in a harmonic structure, a pattern, a ritual. This is more than cruelty. It's liturgical abuse, structured, deliberate, belief-driven. In 1994, an anthropology team from Miskatonic University, yes, that one, conducted a secret, unpermitted dig beneath the Ainsley basement. They were stopped by local authorities within 3 hours. But in that short time, they unearthed what appeared to be an iron ring fused to the foundation. Wrapped around it, the remains of linen binding straps. One of the archaeologists, who requested anonymity, claimed to have seen a circle of markings carved into the floor in a 12-point formation. Some matched Latin sigils of silence and submission. Others were unknown. They looked more like tonal notations than symbols, like music, but not meant to be played, meant to be recited by a voice that doesn't want to sing. What does this all point to? It points to the ritualized silencing of children as a form of spiritual transmission. It suggests that Elizabeth and Thomas Ainsley believed they were not harming children, but saving them, purifying them, turning their pain into harmony. One child's suffering was a note, 12 became a chord, and in that chord they believed God, or something like him, could be heard. There is evidence, fragmentary but chilling, that this ritual had a name. In Elizabeth's final journal, a phrase is repeated, cantus absconsus, Latin, translated the hidden song. When reviewed by linguists and theologians, that phrase is found nowhere else in Scripture. But in one obscure 16th century text on liturgical possession, it appears in a footnote, a chant said to emerge from beneath the tongues of infants who have never spoken, a melody of submission, said to open the gate of ears that are not of this world. We can only speculate what the Ainsleys believed they were hearing beneath their home. But from recovered witness accounts and Dr. Keen's journals, one description appears over and over, a hum, low, steady, layered, coming from beneath the floor, and sometimes rising into melody. The final page of Thomas Ainsley's private ledger, now housed in a restricted collection, reads, "She will not stop, even with the dirt in her mouth. Her song is flawed, but it calls something." That child, number 12, was Mary Delane, and we believe her voice is the one captured on the wax cylinder labeled Ainsley, 1888, voice. You'll hear it soon. But know this. The Ainsleys were not random abusers. They were faithful practitioners of a doctrine designed to break children's will in the name of silence. And the sound that leaked from their basement wasn't just screaming. It was a hymn, one sung by the broken, for something that listens beneath. By the winter of 1892, Birch Hollow was a town sick with secrets. The air stung differently. Houses were shuttered before sunset. And the Ainsley house stood on the hill, like a scab no one dared to peel. not because they believed the wound beneath had healed, but because they knew it never would. But someone did peel it, and what they found underneath has haunted this state's history ever since. On the morning of December 14th, 1892, following immense public pressure and the exposure of falsified records by Lillian Cartwright, the Vermont State Constabulary, alongside federal investigators, was ordered to enter the Ainsley estate by force. The official writ listed the following authorizations: unlawful detainment of minors, destruction of public health records, suspected ritual abuse, potential concealment of deceased individuals. What was not listed, of course, was what they expected to find, because no one knew, not even those leading the charge. The house was unlocked when they arrived, not a single latch or bolt fastened. The door swung open with a hollow creak, as if it had been waiting. Inside, silence. Not the warm hush of abandonment, but a pressurized stillness, like the air itself was being held back. Investigators entered with lanterns and surgical masks, not for disease, but because a scent hung in the air. One deputy described it as like hot copper and milk left out too long. In the parlor, 12 chairs were arranged in a circle. On each chair, a folded child's nightgown, numbered, tidy. Above the mantel, carved into the wall with unnatural precision, one hymn, 12 notes. No noise. The house was explored room by room. Each upstairs bedroom bore a Roman numeral. Each contained a child-sized bed, fitted with straps, a mirror positioned at face level, turned inward, a small shelf holding only a tin bowl, a cloth, and a devotional book titled Path to Stillness. Not a single toy, no photographs, no journals, no bedding. Each room was sterile and cold. In the kitchen, dried blood was found beneath the floorboards. In the pantry, several jars filled with what appeared to be dissolved fabric and preserved strands of hair, some braided into patterns that matched silent sigils from Elizabeth Ainsley's journals. And on the far wall, a door, reinforced, with 12 iron bolts. Behind it, the basement stairwell. It descended at an unnatural slant, too steep for ordinary use. The basement was not, by any sane measure, a cellar. It was a chamber, and the air grew heavier with each step. One officer vomited halfway down. Another claimed to hear singing from inside his skull. But what they found at the bottom is among the most horrifying discoveries in Vermont history. A full chamber, 30 feet in diameter. Walls of stone, sanded smooth, carved with unrecognizable script. The room was arranged like a clock face, with 12 shallow depressions in the floor, each about the size of a small child's body. 11 of them were filled with skeletal remains, wrapped in linen, bound with twine, and numbered in charcoal. The 12th was empty. In the center of the room, a stone pedestal. Upon it sat a wax cylinder. Label, "She never finished." Forensic reports documented the remains as prepubescent, estimates ranging from age 5 to 10. Most bore signs of malnutrition, healed fractures, and prolonged restraint. A few had cranial damage consistent with repeated blunt trauma. Some had no hyoid bone, suggesting strangulation or surgical removal, but it was the walls that disturbed the investigators the most. Etched into every surface, hundreds of tiny handprints, different sizes, different depths, some smeared in what was later confirmed to be dried blood, and in the far corner of the chamber, half embedded in the wall, a small, rusted bed frame fitted with leather cuffs. On the bed frame, a velvet ribbon, clenched in a child's jawbone. The house was sealed, declared a site of ritualized homicide, but no criminal charges were ever filed. Why? Because Thomas and Elizabeth Ainsley were never found. No bodies, no graves, no sightings. They had vanished, leaving behind their creation. Some claimed they walked into the forest and froze. Others believed they took their own lives. But a few, those who remembered the hum, insisted something else had taken them, something they had summoned. The wax cylinder was taken into custody and preserved. It wasn't played publicly for nearly a century, but in 1988, during an academic conference on parapsychological linguistics, it was finally restored and transferred to magnetic tape. I have a copy. I will not play it here, but I will describe what's on it. It begins with the sound of breathing, small, shaky, childlike, then a humming, a melody with no clear root key, composed of 4 tones that never quite resolve, and then a voice, a girl's. She sings, "The dark is in the wall again. The quiet holds my hand. I'm not alone, I'm never gone. The hymn still wants to stand." Then silence. Then, so faint it almost isn't there. I wasn't the last. I was just the quietest. The recording ends with the sound of something scratching wood. 3 slow knocks, then nothing. In the years that followed, researchers, folklorists, and criminal investigators tried to make sense of the chamber's design. None could. The Ainsley house was burned in 1971 by unknown arsonists. Only the stone basement remains, hidden beneath brush and ivy. But the land remembers. Hikers near the old trail to Dunlow Hill sometimes report hearing lullabies echoing beneath their feet. And in 2003, a group of college students recorded a faint tone, 4 notes, on a static channel near the site. The recording matches the wax cylinder. Exactly. What justice looks like, especially in cases like this, is never clean. Not when the guilty vanish. Not when the dead can't speak for themselves, and certainly not when the system that allowed it all to happen is still busy looking the other way. In the wake of the Ainsley raid, there were no trials, no convictions, no graves to mourn properly. There were only files, bones, and one voice on a wax cylinder. But the damage, it didn't end there, because trauma doesn't stay in the ground. It moves, through time, through people. Through the survivors, what few there were. Let's start with Mary Delane. She was the last child brought to the Ainsley house, number 12. The unfinished note, the voice that never went quiet. No death certificate was ever issued, no grave. And yet, in 1904, a woman matching her description was discovered in a sanitarium in western New York under the name Mariel D. She was mute, kept her head tilted to the left, as though listening to something only she could hear, refused mirrors, and hummed a 4-note pattern in her sleep over and over. A psychiatric evaluation from that year reads, "Patient shows signs of ritual-induced aphasia, severe startled response to the word 12, believes she is being followed by the unfinished song." She died in 1908, heart failure, age unknown. But the day after her death, nurses reported something strange. All 12 of the ward's antique clocks had stopped, each at a different hour, forming a perfect clockwise spiral. And then there was Lillian Cartwright, the journalist who exposed it all, then died of a laudanum overdose. Officially, her death was ruled a suicide. But one letter, never mailed, was found in her nightstand. Addressed to her editor, it read, "They never stop humming. Every child I find, they pull me back to her. She wants to finish the song, but there's no one left to hear it." Pinned to the letter, a child's braid. DNA testing in 2002 confirmed it came from at least 3 individuals, none of them biologically related. Other names surfaced too. Dorothy Pennick, the housekeeper who once swept the Ainsley porch, was found catatonic in a home for the elderly in 1936. She had carved the bean into her bed frame, over and over. Gilbert Wainscott, the carpenter's son who glimpsed the basement, he hanged himself in his barn. His suicide note was 1 sentence. "She still sings through the pipes." A dim, but the most chilling aftermath came in 1948, when a new family, completely unaware of the home's history, built a small summer cabin near the ruins of the Ainsley estate. Their daughter, Emily, age 9, began having night terrors. She would wake screaming, "She's under the stone, she's missing her note." The family dismissed it as imagination, until Emily stopped speaking altogether. Later, she was found in the cellar of the cabin, clutching a music box she hadn't been given. Inside, a velvet ribbon and a recorded melody on a tin disc, 4 notes, identical to the wax cylinder. The family moved out that night. The cabin remains abandoned to this day. In 1959, the Vermont Historical Society attempted to catalogue the Ainsley site as part of a preservation effort. The project was terminated after 3 researchers resigned mid-investigation, citing acute auditory hallucinations and a presence beneath the stone. One of them, a skeptic named Dr. Roger Hume, published a brief account in an academic journal. "I do not believe in ghosts, but I believe in trauma." And something was fed in that basement, ritualized, methodical trauma. It echoes, in the trees, in the soil. It never finished. So what of the law? The courts? The Congregation of Stillness was officially declared defunct in 1901. Their remaining members faded into quiet church pulpits or rural sects. But their texts, their belief system, still circulate in small private corners of fringe theology. Occasionally, a book surfaces in estate sales, marked only by the mouthless child symbol. In 1997, an underground religious group in Idaho was raided. Inside, investigators found a wall etched with 12 names, none matching public records. They also found 12 pairs of shoes and a hymn, handwritten and unfinished. The melody matched the Ainsley cylinder. To this day, no charges have ever been brought against any living member connected to the Ainsleys or the congregation, because no one talked, because silence protected them, just like it hurt the children. And that's the real story here, not the cult, not even the basement. It's the silence around it all, the silence we mistake for peace, the silence we accept when the truth is too hard to say out loud. But Mary's voice, number 12's voice, she never stopped trying. She hummed through the walls, through the years, through wax and wood and bone, trying to finish the song. Time has a way of hardening over horror, like ice sealing a wound. But under that stillness, the blood still pulses. And sometimes, when the wind shifts just right, you hear what was buried, not as a scream, but as a song. I returned to the Ainsley site in the spring of this year. The remains of the house are gone now, charred stones, overtaken by roots and frost-heaved earth. But the basement, it's still there. Beneath brush and soil and time, it waits. I didn't go inside, I couldn't. But I sat at the edge of the foundation, where wild violets grow in strange concentric circles. I listened, and though I heard nothing, I felt something, a kind of pressure, like the world around me was holding its breath, as if waiting for a voice that was never allowed to grow up. In 2015, Vermont's General Assembly quietly passed Resolution 442, acknowledging undocumented loss of life in Birch Hollow and recognizing the failure of state oversight in historical child welfare systems. No names, no charges, just regret, notarized. A memorial was proposed and at first denied, but it was the work of a small group of volunteers, librarians, genealogists, trauma advocates, that brought it back. In 2020, construction began on a memorial garden just outside of Redhall, near what used to be Dunlow Hill. It's not large. 12 birch trees stand in a ring, each with a child's name carved into the wood. Not the names given by the Ainsleys, but the ones unearthed, cross-referenced, and reclaimed by researchers and, in some cases, distant descendants. Some of them never had full names. Some were known only by the initials on their orphanage tags, but all of them now have a place. At the center of the garden, a black stone slab. Etched into it, "You were not noise. You were music never allowed to play. We hear you now." I spoke with Elena Wood, one of the volunteers who designed the memorial. Her great-aunt had been a midwife in Birch Hollow during the 1880s. Elena never knew about the Ainsley house until she found a journal hidden in her attic. She told me, "They used to say Elizabeth Ainsley loved children, but love isn't silence. Love is listening to the noise. The messy, loud, beautiful noise children make, and never ever trying to take it from them." The wax cylinder, Mary's song, now rests in the Vermont State Archives in a soundproofed case. It's been digitized, analyzed, dissected, but no one has ever replicated the full tonality of her voice. No one has been able to recreate the resonance of that final note. Audio specialists say it shouldn't be possible, that no child could have produced a frequency that low. But when played through a spectrum analyzer, the waveform forms a pattern, a spiral, 12 turns, winding inward, ending in silence. There are still those who believe the congregation of stillness exists, hidden, fragmented, waiting. Every so often, a tract surfaces, a page torn from the voice below flesh, a symbol scratched into a floorboard, a hush cap found in an attic with no known origin, and people still whisper about places where children vanish or grow quiet overnight, places where basements don't align with blueprints, where crying never echoes. But I don't want to end this story with fear, because this isn't just about what was lost, it's about what was found and remembered. In 2023, a group of middle school students from Addison County created a choral piece inspired by the Ainsley case. It's called Mary's Song Finished. The melody uses the 4 tones from the wax cylinder, but the final note, where Mary always fell silent, is now completed. Sung in full, held for 10 seconds, long enough for her voice to finally rest. So here we are, at the end, a house on a hill, 12 empty beds, a cellar full of echoes, but also 12 names carved into birch, a garden that grows in the silence, and a voice that after more than a century was finally heard. Because sometimes the most trusted people are the ones we should have feared most, and sometimes the quietest children were never silent at all. They were just waiting for someone to listen. This is Daniel Harrow, and you've been listening to the Macabre Record.